Do you know what time it is? It's supernatural story time. And if you're easily scared, and even if you're not, there's only one thing left to do. Just turn off the lights, because these are stories that you listen to only in the dark.
Encounters with the Unknown, Volume 4, Story 1. I grew up and still live in a very small town in the northern part of the Bitterroot Range, just stones throw away from the Montana border. My young adulthood was spent with two very close friends, always camping, hiking, and fishing in the heaven that God created here in the Pacific Northwest. It was the fall of 1989, and we found a new mountain to hike and explore just north of town. One afternoon, we found a beautiful little clearing with a large aspen stand on the western edge that cast a beautiful yellow and orange light as the sun began to settle behind them. We decided this was a great spot to find a place to sit down and talk about all of the things that are important to a 15-year-old group of guys. Girls, guns, girls, and girls. Just at the edge of the aspens, we found what looked to be the foundation logs of an old cabin. Not really rare around these parts, but always interesting, and it just made this an even better place to sit and swap the wisdoms of youth. Not long after we were settled in, leaned back against the sloping dirt and log foundation covered in pleasant-smelling fall leaves, discussing the finer points of the opposite sex, or maybe why MacGyver refused to use guns. We all stopped mid-laugh. The hair on the back of my neck stood like a bird dog in a pheasant field, and the look on my friends' faces seemed to tell me they felt the same thing. Just inside the aspen grove, we could hear what sounded like a little girl singing and laughing along with us. Her quiet voice echoed with an eerie calmness that didn't inspire fear so much as a discomfort of knowing that it just wasn't possible. The singing and laughing subsided after a very long 3 to 5 minutes and left us all staring blankly at one another. It wasn't long after that when we decided we had rested enough and perhaps it was time to very quickly return to more familiar territory. As fall slowly started giving way to winter, we made our way back there no less than 3 times, and each one yielded to singing and laughing. It no longer scared us, rather, we began to find our company both somehow pitiful and comforting at the same time. As winter took its icy hold, the aspen grove and the laughing girl were all but forgotten as our outdoor activities were curtailed by the deep snow. I didn't think about her again, hardly, until 2 years later. A family friend said his grandmother needed someone to mow her lawn, and I volunteered. This woman was one of the oldest in the area, and actually the area that she lived in had been named after her father, being the first to settle there. I spent all summer mowing her lawn once a week for $5, and a great glass of iced tea afterwards, which was always served with her telling me a great many stories about the old days. Once she mentioned that there was a family with 4 children that lived a few miles back in the woods, and the children would come down the mountain every day for school and walk with her. The youngest girl was 9 years old, and the woman said that 1 year after the melt, only 3 children came to school. The youngest had died over the winter. I was shocked, as this would have been the right area that we had found the cabin remnants in, and I asked her if their cabin had been pretty close to what we call the Indian Circle, a little-known local landmark that the Indians at one time used as a meeting place for trade and barter with the locals. A large ring of rocks in the middle of the woods is all that remained then. She confirmed that yes, they lived by the aspen grove there. I have visited the place since by myself and haven't heard her again, but I usually leave her something in the aspens. A flower, a doll, a yo-yo once. One thing is for sure, I have no question who she may have been, and I only hope she has found rest and peace with whatever is beyond here. Story number 2. My wife and I were driving in Alabama one Saturday morning, and we were just starting on our vacation. We had only been on the road about an hour and a half when we passed through a small town. For some unknown reason, at the time, I had this strange feeling of impending doom wash over me, almost nauseating in its strength. I had this sudden desire to stop or pull over even though I wasn't hungry or thirsty, and I didn't need a bathroom break. I mentioned it to my wife and she said that she didn't feel anything and that we should keep going. Okay, so I should have listened to the feeling. We were about 4 or 5 miles north of the town now, and I still felt like something bad was going to happen. We were coming to the crest of a hill and meeting quite a bit of southbound traffic on the 2-lane highway when a car topped a hill in our lane trying to pass 3 vehicles. There was no way to avoid a head-on collision, and I barely had time to say those famous last words, "Oh, shit," when we collided with what was later determined to be a combined 125-mile-per-hour impact. The guy that hit us at 70 miles per hour wasn't wearing his seatbelt and flew through his windshield and hit ours face first before flipping over our car. He did not survive. My wife and I were both seriously injured, but somehow she managed to get out of the car after a brief struggle. I was pinned in the smoking car with a deep gash in my leg that was bleeding profusely. 3 witnesses said the crash happened at 9:23 a.m. Now, for the really weird part. At 9:25 a.m., a police car, fire truck, and ambulance arrived at the scene from the town that we had just passed through. Fast response, right? My wife and I were taken to 2 different hospitals after a brief trip to the local Band-Aid station, which got the bleeding from my legs somewhat under control. On the 50-ish mile ride to the nearest large hospital, the EMTs in the ambulance asked me what I remembered, but they looked extremely uncomfortable. I told them what happened and thanked them for their incredibly fast response. They looked at each other and I could tell they wanted to say something, so I asked them what was wrong, fearing the worst for my wife. He said my wife was fine. Then he unloaded the bomb on me. They had received a 911 call from a hysterical lady at a payphone in that very town at 9:11 a.m., reporting a violent head-on collision at the exact location of our wreck. They had taken 14 minutes to arrive at the scene and were astonished to learn that the accident had occurred only a couple of minutes before they arrived. He waited a moment for me to soak this in before adding that the only explanation that he could think of was that someone had a premonition that was so strong that they actually called in the report. The deceased driver of the other vehicle was very intoxicated. My wife and I made full recoveries from our injuries, but the image of the other driver's face impacting on our windshield will forever haunt us both. To this day, nobody knows who made that call, but I am very thankful that they did. Next story. Back in 1973, 2 teenage friends and I took a small powerboat to a wilderness area on Smith Mountain Lake in southwest Virginia. I was into bow hunting at the time and carried my bow and arrows with me. We didn't have any other weapons except a knife or 2. We tied the boat on the shoreline, then set up our camp in the woods on the edge of the lake. We fished, cooked dinner, had a few beers. Way off in the distance, we could hear sirens and some kind of loud alarm going off, but we didn't think too much about it, outside of musing about what was happening. Finally, the fire died down and we crawled into our sleeping bags. All of a sudden, we hear someone whistling the death march. It would be on one side of our little camp, then it started again on the other side. You could hear the crunch of leaves underfoot occasionally as a person moved through the woods around us, but the whistling was the creepiest part. We doused the embers. One friend, the youngest, started quietly whimpering, while my other friend handled it stoically. We were all spooked. Me, being me, I grabbed my bow, knocked an arrow, and crept to a dark copse of trees where I could both watch over my friends and watch the boat. The rustling and whistling continued. Never could locate the person. It was just too dark and a bit foggy. We stayed up all night, nerves all a-tingle. Finally, when it was light enough to break camp, we did. It was a relief to watch the shore fade. Upon getting back to the dock, we learned there had been a prison break from a facility not too far from our location, and several of the inmates had escaped into the woods. There was a big manhunt going on. When I get together with my friends now, which isn't often as we're scattered around the country, we still talk about that freaky night in the woods. Next story. This is an experience I had with a buddy. It was very spooky. It was while we were hog deer hunting deep in a river swamp in northwest Florida. We hiked in a little over a mile from the truck to a great place to camp that we found a couple of weeks prior. We packed light for a couple of nights of roughing it in a very isolated area and planned to hunt out of the camp. We reached the site a little before dark on Friday. We quickly struck a fire and got set up for the night, enjoying a meal of deer, backstrap, and baked potatoes. At around 2:30 a.m., we were both awakened by a chilling howl, roar from the swamp, but it was a good distance from us. We restoked the fire, looked at each other, shrugged, and crashed out again. We were up well before daylight, made a couple of fried egg sandwiches for breakfast, and headed deeper into the woods. We split up and hunted till lunch, having agreed to meet back on the trail. As we stood there recounting our morning, we heard some god-awful squealing from some wild hogs not far from us, so we fanned out and headed toward them. We hadn't gone far when we froze in our tracks. The hogs were coming straight at us and splashing through the swamp in some kind of a hurry. As they came within sight, my buddy took a smallish sow out with his 30-30, but the rest ran past us like we weren't even there. Now, wild boar hogs can be vicious creatures, and the largest one of these was pushing 350 pounds, maybe more. He ran between us like a black streak with the rest close behind. Something had terrified those hogs, no doubt. We dragged the sow to the trail for field dressing, but started hearing a single pig squealing from where we had first heard them. We heard a pronounced hollow thud, followed by deafening silence, including us. Well, we couldn't stand the mystery any longer and decided to follow an oak ridge that should curl around pretty close to where the ruckus was. As we got close to where we thought it was, something bolted 100 yards in front of us and ran through the water at an angle away from us. Whatever it was big, heavy, and ran on 2 legs. We never saw it and don't know what it was, but I'm 6'3" and 245 pounds, and there's no way that I could have run through that stuff like it did. Both of us had a 30-30. He also had a 44 mag, and I had a 357 mag sidearm. We walked forward to the point of the oak ridge. Mind you, the ridge is only a few feet higher than the water, and found blood and signs of a scuffle. There was also foul smell in the immediate area, but it may have been from the pig emptying its bowels there. What I saw next made my blood run cold. About a head higher than I stand was a wad of hog hair and blood on the rough bark of an old oak tree, and the hair was in the tree bark all the way down the trunk to the ground, where there was a lot of blood. Something had picked up a hog and slammed it into the tree, obviously killing it, although it was nowhere to be found. We decided against further adventures and went back to collect our hog and go back to camp. Our hog wasn't there. No drag marks, no footprints, nothing. We agreed to continue our camping trip, and it was without further incident. We weren't afraid, but I must admit that we were both more alert and watchful. Whatever it was, I have the utmost respect for its power and cunning intelligence. Next story. Strangest thing I've personally witnessed was about 10 or 12 years ago. My wife's parents live an hour outside Montreal heading towards Quebec City. Behind their house is a maple sugar camp which must be about 100 acres in size. There's tons of trails through the bush that crisscross all over, and the owner, being a friend of my father-in-law, has no problem letting us go in there. One night, during a full moon, my wife and I decided to go for a walk on the trails. There had been a heavy snowfall, and walking in the snow during a full moon was something we liked to do. I grabbed the flashlight and out we went. As we entered the trail, my wife spotted the tracks of what looked like a large dog ahead of us in the fresh snow. The snow was about 6 to 8 inches deep and with absolutely no other tracks, so we decided to follow them. The flashlight and full moon made it really easy to see the tracks, and we followed them along one of the trails deep in the bush area. As we walked, I took note that the animal seemed to be purposely moving with no interest other than where it was going. There were no marks in the snow where it might have stopped off to sniff the ground, and there were no marks where it would have stopped to mark its territory. Just paw prints in the snow heading down the trail. As we came to a clearing where the trail intersected another, the tracks just stopped, dead. There were no marks to say it had stopped and stood there. It was as if it had been plucked from the snow in mid-stride. We stood for a while trying to figure out where the animal had gone. I started to do widening circles around the end of the tracks to see if it had jumped clear of the trail and headed in a different direction. Nothing. Heading out of the bush that night was a bit unnerving. We own Chesapeake Bay retrievers, and the tracks were about the same size as one of our 80-pound dogs. Next story. I haven't had a chance to get out much until fairly recently. I've been healing up for a few months after having surgery. But lately I've started on a conditioning regimen to prepare for a big hike me and another guy are going on at the end of the summer. There's a levee with a bike and hike trail across the top of it that the city built about a mile from my house, and it stretches for a good 5 or 6 miles following the general course of the river upstream. Outside of town there is a county road that follows the levee at the bottom for a half-mile or so, then curves back east away from it. Then, at about every mile or so, another road will curve back by it again, with a locked gate being at the end of a short driveway for city and county maintenance trucks to get through. It's kind of hard to explain what it's like to someone without them having actually seen it, but hopefully you get the idea. I loaded up my pack and hiked it for a few miles. Generally, try to get in 5 miles at a time, 2 to 3 times a week as time allows. It's early enough when I get out there, and there's rarely anyone on the trail, except for the random jogger or dog walker. The first half-mile or so of the trail skirts the rough part of town as well before it goes out into the country. After a couple of times of hiking out there, I decided one morning instead of coming back, I was going to head further north towards the end of the trail and do some camping in one of the wooded sections, which is allowed, though a bit of a gray area by the river. Felt good about it, as I haven't had a chance to solo camp for a while, and saw it as an opportunity to brush up on some bushcraft skills in the cold. I followed the levee trail for about an hour and a half, still dark out, not in a real hurry, just kind of walking my own pace and taking it easy. I was on the stretch that was skirted by the road and saw headlights on it. Didn't think anything of it and kept doing like I was doing. Then the headlights hit me. Car stopped for a minute, crept up a little bit, and stopped again, like they were keeping the lights on me. Then the car tore out of there real quick. Thought that was strange, but kept on trucking. The sun was starting to come up, and I stopped to take a break and apply a little duct tape to a spot on my foot that was developing a hot spot. Piddled for 10 or 15 minutes and got up and started again. I came up on a spot on the trail that one of the city access points was at, with a road at the bottom of the levee, and that same car was parked at the bottom. I gave it the benefit of the doubt, thinking maybe whoever was in it was out jogging the trail or something and just parked there. But I did move over to where I was walking on the side of the trail furthest from the road. The levee is about 40 to 50 feet high, and the trail has a pretty pronounced crown in the middle. So, where I was walking, standing at the bottom, it would have been a little difficult to see me. I walked without incident, then about 100 yards down, I started walking on the top again. Heard the car fire up and take off. There was one more intersection and gate I had to walk by to get to the wide wooded section where I planned to camp, and when I came up on it, lo and behold, that same car was there again. By this time it was daylight, so you could have seen me coming a ways off. Started to get an uneasy feeling and thought, F this, and I dropped off the levee trail and slid down to the bottom on the side opposite the road. There was a strip of woods between the levee and the river itself, maybe 75 yards wide, and I went into them about 100 feet and dropped my gear behind some brush that was choked up with debris from the last flood. Settled in behind it, and I was hidden pretty well. It was like a natural blind almost, and I feel lucky to have found it where and when I did. I couldn't see the top of the levee from where I was, so I started to clear out a little peephole through the hanging crap when I heard the echo of 2 car doors open and shut. I hunkered down and kept quiet, and before long I heard crunching on the gravel on the trail, like someone milling about. I never could see them, but I know that there was at least 2 guys, and I heard one of them go, "No, he was just here." Didn't hear the response clearly enough to know what it was, but they walked a little ways up and down the trail. Got to thinking, oh shit, they're going to find my tracks. But turns out they didn't. After a little while, they came back, and then I heard the crunching fade. Then heard the doors open and shut again, and they took off. I spent another 20 minutes or so where I was before moving again. This time, I stuck to the woods until it opened up in a small field. Walked across it and got into the section of woods I planned to camp in. Set up camp deep in there and didn't have another incident for the rest of the trip or the walk back the next day. So, I'm not sure what those guys' intentions were, but given the circumstances, I opted to be safe rather than sorry. I normally carry my pistol when I camp, but being this is city property, no guns are allowed. So all I had on me, weapons-wise, was a knife. Been back out there on the levee trail once since then, granted not as far north as I was, and haven't had any trouble. Maybe it was just being paranoid when I dropped off and hid in the woods, but I felt like it was the right thing to do. Like so many people will say on and off, it's the two-legged critters that worry me the most. Next story. This happened a number of years ago. My hiking partner and I were on a short afternoon hike in a part of the mountains just west of the Sonora Desert where we had not hiked before. In the late afternoon, we realized that we had traveled further into the wilderness than we should have and decided that we should quickly walk toward what we could see above the treetops was the setting sun. We knew our car was parked on a road we would eventually cross if we continued walking west. Our biggest concern was getting out before it became too dark. The trail we were on was narrow, and it was easy to stumble over the occasional tree root or rocks. It was not the trail we had taken on the way in. As we were walking one behind the other, we became aware that something large was keeping pace with us on the other side of trees and brush about 15 feet to our left. It was not crashing through the brush, but was just making enough noise to be heard. Occasionally we heard bird calls that sounded to me like they were made by humans signaling each other. My interpretation of the sounds may have been the result of paranoia, but when I was younger, my brother and I used to do this in the woods, and unless you're very talented, it doesn't sound like a real bird. In any event, other than the sounds of us and the thing, it was dead silent. I whispered to my hiking companion to not get separated and not run. I was afraid that if it was a mountain lion, running would trigger an attack, not to mention that my friend could outrun me. Essentially, we were within arm's reach of each other, one behind the other, speed walking. Whatever it was keeping up, and daylight was moving into dusk. Did I mention that we were completely unarmed? We came around a curve in the trail and stopped dead. Before us, the trail went down into near total darkness. We couldn't risk turning back. We couldn't turn right because there was a drop-off, and it would have been crazy to go off-trail in the dark. We couldn't go off-trail to left for obvious reasons. We knew the road crossed the trail somewhere ahead, but how far? We really didn't know. We did the only thing we could do. When every fiber of our beings was telling us to run, we slowed down so we wouldn't trip and fall, and descended into darkness. During those moments, at the lowest point of that trail in the dark, I could hear my heart pounding. The thing continued to move parallel to us. Suddenly the trail ascended, and we topped a knoll and emerged from the trees. The parallel sound stopped. About 100 feet ahead of us was the road. I was never happier to see pavement. We made it to the car as dusk slipped into night. To this day, I have no idea what was following us. The bird calls make me think it was human, but I don't know how a human could possibly have kept pace with us off-trail, especially without making a huge amount of noise. If I had to pick a likely animal, it would be a mountain lion, but I don't think you hear a mountain lion moving. I'll never know. Next story. Being one of the only ones in my circle of friends that enjoys taking to the outdoors, I usually do it by myself. It was sometime last year during spring, although you wouldn't know it by judging by the hot Florida sun cutting through the humid atmosphere. With the sun high in the sky, I set out for a short hiking trip on county land just outside of town. It's a public park and getting only mild usage. I can usually have the trails to myself. Wanting to deviate from my normal southerly path through over-beaten paths, I headed north and discovered that the county had used the natural river that runs alongside the park as a levee system. Always up for some investigating and shocked that I hadn't known it was there before, I climbed on top of it and started heading north a couple of 100 yards before I looked down to my right and saw some prime forest that I hadn't hiked before. I stumbled down the 40 feet or so down to the level ground and headed into the brush. I discovered a path that cut through the middle of the woods and decided to take it. I only made it about 10 yards in before I felt something staring at me from my right side. Immediately, all my senses went on red alert as I quieted my breathing so that I could listen into the brush. Softening my footsteps, there was no way I was stopping. I could hear shifting of the environment just beyond the edge of the path. It was subtle, but I could tell by the amount of brush shifting that whatever it was large. My heart started beating faster, but I stiffened my resolve. I told myself I was being paranoid and that it was like mostly a larger-sized squirrel. Yeah, it's just a squirrel rustling around. I kept telling myself this as I shifted my eyes back and forth, no longer trusting the green space to my left either. I started moving faster. I knew there was a clearing in another 25 yards that would bring me back out to the tall levee. I could feel the energy moving behind me now. I knew I was being stalked, and I pressed my hand on the fixed blade I had hanging off from my belt. Just 50 more yards, and I'd seen sunlight. 50 more yards, and maybe there'd be other people around. Having people off in the distance would do nothing for me if it was a fast-moving boar or a Florida panther, both of which are far too common in these parts. But I had another fear, one that I knew could only be remedied by public space and other people. This park outlies a city with some of the highest crime and murder rates in the state, a dark side to society that I'd become all too familiar with during my residence there. As long as I was in those woods, there would be no witnesses to anything that happened, no matter by man or beast. I hastened my step and finally pushed out into the sunlight, taking in huge breaths of air as I squinted in the bright light. I immediately turned west and headed for the perceived safety of the highly visible levee, and only when I was about 20 yards out and at the base of the incline did I dare look back behind me, back into the dark opening that led into the woods from which I just came. Nothing followed me out, but I could feel it at the edge of the brush staring back at me. I climbed back up onto the levee, shook out my fears, and pushed forward, noting not to deviate off the race path when I am that far back in no man's land, alone again. Next story. I grew up in southwest Oregon along the Rogue River. If the river was fishable, we'd usually have a jet sled in the water. We'd only pull it out to do maintenance or if the river was rising rapidly. One day, when I was old enough to drive, Dad decided we needed to get the boat out. We parked the boats along the shore about a half-mile above our house. The public ramp at Foster Bar was about a mile below the house. He took off walking to get the boat, while I hooked a trailer on his work truck and headed for the ramp to meet him. In summer, it's a fairly busy ramp. Could be 40 or 50 cars there, but in winter, it's dead. Quiet, empty. I backed the trailer down into the water, cut the engine, and walked up the bank, skipping rocks while I waited for Dad to arrive. I just happened to have a very early Smith & Wesson 357, not the later 8 3/8 barrel, one of the early registered guns. I stuffed it in my belt, cross-draw style, and threw a handful of shells in my pocket before I left the truck. I got 75 yards or so up the boulder bar when another rig arrived. The boulder bar is about 150 yards long and about 75 yards wide, with a concrete loading-unloading ramp clear at the bottom end. Just about dead center is a pile of bigger rocks, maybe 3 feet high. You can drive clear around on both sides, sort of makes a circle drive. I had my back turned to them, but I was keeping an eye on what was going on. After a couple of minutes, they got out of the truck and split up. One sort of casually moseyed towards upriver above me, blocking my on-foot exit. One sort of casually moseyed downriver, separating me from the truck. And one started towards me, coming straight over that rock pile in the middle of the parking lot. Then I got that bad feeling. I just sort of casually, without looking at any of them, drew that old 57 out of my belt, eared the hammer back, and drew a bead on a seagull floating by. Those guys swapped directions and went right back to their truck. Within a minute or two, I heard Dad's boat engine coming, so I headed back toward the truck. But somehow those guys got between me and the truck. Before he got there, were waiting as he beached the boat. When he jumped out on the bank, his holstered revolver swung out into sight. Those guys headed back toward their truck. They passed within about 30 feet of me. I heard one of them saying something to the effect of, "Damn, all these effers have guns. Now what do we do? Then they fired up the truck and left. Not sure what they wanted. Steal our old truck? Rob us? Thrill kill? I don't know. But whatever it was, minus our guns, something bad would have happened. Next story. In fall of 1989 or 90, I spent a day deer hunting in the Coast Range of southwest Oregon, then headed east towards I-5 to return to Eugene, where I was living. It was a chilly day. I got sort of cold, worked hard, walked hard, and got back to my truck a bit before dark. I headed east. The road was steep, the grade exceeding 20% in spots, one lane surfaced with oiled rolled gravel. On the other hand, there are places that aren't quite straight, but you can see clear through the curves and push 70 miles per hour if you've got the nerve for it. The heater began to work, I started to warm up, and I started to get pretty tired. I was traveling along at a pretty good speed, 50 to 60 miles an hour, straightening the curves and flattening the hills. Not a good speed to be sort of sleepy. After a few miles, it got dark. I caught one car that moved over for me and piled on headlong into the steepest, twistiest part. Though the day had been sunny, the previous night was foggy. I came down and around one of those corners just barely sliding in a remnant wet patch on the pavement. All hell broke loose. I was sideways for the width of the damn patch under that tree, then hit dry pavement and the tires hooked up. It launched me at about 45 towards the bank with no time to do much of anything. The ditch between me and the bank had been dug out with a backhoe, so it was probably 10 to 15 feet wide, 3 to 4 feet below road level and straight up and down with what looked like an air-drilled and blasted sheer rock face on the other side. I'd managed to hit the brakes a little, so I was only doing about 35 when I felt the front tires leave the edge of the pavement and the front of the truck go airborne. The last thing I remember was that feeling of being airborne in my truck with a massive sheer rock wall coming at me less than 10 feet away at 35 miles an hour. Then, nothing. Blackness. I assumed I'd hit that rock wall head on, airborne at 35 or so. I went through the mental checklist. What hurts? Which of my parts might be broken or punctured? Move my fingers, toes, etc. Everything seemed to check out. Next step. Better shut off the engine and lights so if I've got a ruptured gas tank, I don't catch fire and burn up, right? I reached for the key to turn off the ignition. What? I mean, seriously. WTF? The ignition switch was turned to the off position. Okay, well, headlights next. I reached for the knob and, as you'll probably guess, but totally unexpected for me at the time, they were already off. So, I sat there trying to figure out what was going on, what to do, how to make things add up. Nothing hurt. I thought about it, decided what the heck, and flipped the headlights on. What I saw made no sense. None at all. I should have been looking at a badly crumpled hood, ending where it met a sheer rock face. Instead, I had a void about 20 to 30 feet wide, then green leaves. Alder leaves. What the... About that time, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a glimmer of light, which I realized were headlights coming down the hill behind me, and I better do something. I fired up the engine and backed up just a little bit so I could turn around. What I saw still boggles my mind. I was not in the ditch. I was facing the other direction with my headlights shining out into the trees in the canyon. My truck was not damaged. As I jockeyed it around to get it out of the way of the oncoming car, I could see my own sliding tire tracks. I was 50 to 75 feet uphill from where I'd gone off the road. Based on the time between when I passed the other car and then saw its headlights coming around the corner, factoring for how fast I was driving, I think I lost some time in there. 20, 30 seconds. I can't account for. I don't know what happened. How can a car going downhill, then airborne towards a rock face, fail to hit that rock and instead wind up uphill and facing the other direction? Someone tell me, how do flying cars change directions? I don't know. Something set aside the laws of physics as I understand them that night. Something turned off my ignition switch. Something turned off my headlights. Whatever it was, I think it was sitting in the passenger seat. I felt a presence there I can't explain. The doors were locked. I was alone, but I wasn't. I couldn't look. I was too terrified, unready to process what I was going to see. So, I still don't know. After 50 miles or so, without stopping, that sense of presence finally left and I was okay to look over there. I can't explain it other than to say someone, something, decided it was not my night to die because by everything I know, I shouldn't be here. There should be a cross and some flowers on the foot of that rock wall for me. And that's my story.